You lived in Israel was it the 50s?
53.
53. And how old were you at the time?
How old? Well, I was
I guess
25. Yeah.
Okay.
But I had been an active, what was then called a Zionist youth leader. Now it would be called anti-Zionist youth leader back in the 40s.
Okay. And I think that's very interesting because for people, Zionism means a Jewish state in Palestine. So when you say you were, at the time, a Zionist leader, which now would mean an anti-Zionist leader, yeah. I'd like you to sort of broaden this a bit. Cause,
back in the 1940s, before the state was established, one part of the Zionist movement, and not a small part of it, was opposed to a Jewish state. I mean, the little that's remembered about that is the famous men like Martin Buber and Judah Magnus and Hannah Arendt, women, but that was a peripheral elite. A substantial part of the workers' movement in Israel, then Palestine, was anti-state. Actually, that was the official position of Hashem Eretz Yair, which is like almost half the kibbutz movement. And it was probably 20% or so of the Histadrut, the labor movement. And at least according to the Anglo-American Commission, which did studies at the time, they estimated, if I remember correctly, about a quarter of the population of the Yishuv was opposed to a Jewish state. So being opposed to a Jewish state was part of the Zionist movement. And there was nothing surprising about being a Zionist youth leader who was strongly opposed to a Jewish state and was in favor of Arab-Jewish working-class cooperation to construct a socialist Palestine.
Okay, so is that the frame of mind? Because you went to Israel, Palestine in the 50s once the state of Israel had been established. So is that the frame of mind you went to Israel with?
Once the state of Israel was established, which was actually a day of mourning among me and my friends, I remember it very well. The only rational position to hold was that it should have the rights of any state in the international system, no more, no less. They're all founded on violence and destruction. I mean, take the United States. It's founded on extermination of the indigenous population, many millions of people, conquest of half of Mexico, in order to try to monopolize cotton and all sorts of things. Try to find a state that isn't found. I mean, states are violent systems. Almost all state borders are the result of violence and repression. But there's an international system that we can say, okay, I'm not going to recognize anybody. I'm opposed to everybody. I'm just not going to act in the world. Well, okay, you can live on a mountaintop in Montana and grow your own food if you like, but if you want to function in the world, even as a dissident or as a protester or something, you have to recognize its reality. Okay. Part of the reality is there's an international system, which I don't like, but it's there, and Israel since '48 is part of it.
Okay. So my question about, you recently declared during an interview with Israeli TV that, and I quote now, in fact, I do not regard myself as a critic of Israel, I regard myself as a supporter of Israel. And for people, again, that don't dig further, this could mean I am a supporter of a Jewish state, a colonizing state, and so could you also sort of explain what you meant?
It could mean that to people who pick up tidbits on the internet and don't bother even to listen, let alone to read, because they just listen to the interview, which incidentally was an interview for an Israeli audience. What it says is, the context was a dichotomy that is standard in Israeli culture. Either you support Israel or you want Israel's destruction. And what I said is the people who call themselves supporters of Israel are in fact supporters of Israel's moral degeneration and ultimately destruction. If you're a real supporter of Israel, meaning you want its people to be able to live a decent life, then you would be in favor of Israel meeting its international obligations, eliminating its internal repression, keeping to international law, and so on. That would really be support for Israel. And in that sense, yeah, I'm a supporter of Israel.
Okay, so to clarify, you're a supporter of Israel, but you'd like Israel...
I'm a supporter of Israel in the same sense I'm a supporter of the United States, or of England, or of France, or anyone else. I think circumstances should be... I'm in favor of circumstances which will allow their populations to live decent, honorable lives. And that would mean meeting a variety of conditions, for different states, such as observing international law, eliminating domestic repression, and so on. Okay, so obviously when you talk about the citizens of Israel, you also include the Israeli Palestinians being able to live normal life. That's a crucial part of it.
Okay.
I mean, if they meet their international obligations, they'll return to their borders. And if they deal with internal repression, there's plenty of problems there. So as you say the same about the United States. The people in the United States, if you're a supporter of the people of the United States, and I don't know what other sense there is to support the United States, you'll want it to withdraw, put an end to aggression, put an end to subversion, virtually eliminate the military budget, deal with vicious internal repression. I don't have to go into the details of how, say, the African American population is treated, same with so-called illegal immigrants and so on, problems of extreme inequality and poverty, then there'd be a decent life for Americans. And to support the United States means to be in favor of those things.
So, for example, I think last time I read, there was about 30 discriminatory laws inside Israel, sort of clearly favorism towards the Jewish Israelis compared to the Israeli Arabs or the others. So, those laws, for example, would it be something for a normal state to have those laws changed?
Oh, sure. Unfortunately, not a normal state. A normal state has laws like those and much worse. But yes, those ought to be changed, and I've been writing about it for 40 years. In fact, don't know anyone else who has been. I started writing about the worst of these. There's a lot that's wrong, but the worst of them are the land laws. And I was writing about those in the 60s and 70s. I wrote the introduction to Sabri Jirius's book, Arabs in Israel. That's the first real expose of this. In a book called Towards the New Cold War, came out around 1980. I gave a pretty detailed analysis of the set of administrative and legal practices that effectively banned Palestinian citizens of Israel from about 90% of the land. I think that was the first time that was done. Later, in recent work, I've written about the interesting changes that are taking place. There is, at last, pressure inside Israel within the mainstream civil rights movement. ACRI, the Civil Rights Association, brought cases to the courts to try to terminate those laws, and some interesting developments have taken place. I could describe them, but sure, and the same with other discriminatory laws. Okay.
So you bring us, I guess, if you say you are a supporter of Israel because the reality is Israel exists.
No, it's not. I'm a supporter of Israel in the sense in which I'm a supporter of every other country in the world. I think we should be in favor of circumstances that permit its populations to live decent, honorable lives, satisfying lives. And we should recognize that in a state system, which I don't like but exists, the states should have the same rights as other states. Okay.
Yeah, but my question was about now if we take this to the one state, two states solution.
That's a different question.
Okay.
I've always been first of all, the term one state solution is very misleading. There's just two different societies there. So one state, if you're serious, means a binational state. I was in support of a binational state in the 1940s, as I said, a binational state based on Arab-Jewish working-class cooperation. I've remained so without change. From roughly 67 through 75, I wrote about this pretty extensively, because at that time it was actually feasible to introduce steps towards a binational state. In fact, some proposals like that were even made by Israeli intelligence. That was a period when Israel controlled the region, Palestinian nationalism had not yet been kind of crystallized as a well-formulated position or entered the international agenda, Israel could have moved at that time towards a federal arrangement which would have granted a substantial degree of autonomy to the occupied territories as they were asking, and the notables, not, and as it was a feasible move, and that could have been a significant step towards a true binational settlement. And I wrote about it. It was total anathema. It was bitterly denounced, condemned, hated on all sides. Because it was feasible. That's crucial. It became popular in the late 90s when it's totally unfeasible. And then you can write about it in the New York Times and New York Review of Books, and they all like it. Because it can quickly be interpreted as undermining a two-state settlement, that is, as supporting U.S.-Israeli policy. So therefore it became popular. But when it was feasible, it was anathema. In 1975, the situation changed, roughly then. Palestinian nationalism did become an organized force, to the point where by 1976, the U.S. had to veto Security Council resolution calling for a two-state settlement, and on through the rest of the history, which I won't run through. But from that point on, an immediate call for a binational federation moving on to a binational state was not implementable. The only way of reaching it was in stages, where the first stage would be a two-state settlement, and with an overwhelming international consensus accepted by Palestine National Council, Arab League, Iran, Hamas, everybody, of course all of Europe and non-aligned countries, as a first step, which could have the effect of reducing the cycle of violence, creating the institutions of a degree of self-government among the Palestinians, and lead the way towards erosion of the border, which is extremely artificial and bad for both sides. And under those conditions, you can easily imagine, in fact, think of carrying out actions which would extend commercial, cultural, other interchanges, associations on other than ethnic lines, which would lead to a very natural erosion of the borders and an impetus on both sides, on many sides, because there's not just two, towards moving towards integration into a binational state system, and that's by no means the end of the road. I mean, I don't see any reason why we should honor the imperial boundaries that were set. There's nothing holy about the boundaries that the British and the French drew in the region.
So you're talking about Jordan and Syria?
Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. I mean, it's all just imperial settlements like Iraq. So I think what we should, unless we are dedicated supporters of imperial power, we should say, yeah, those are all illegitimate too. And we should be thinking about how to move towards a regional arrangement, which might in fact have some of the properties of the Ottoman Empire. It's not so exotic. Nobody wants the Ottoman Empire back with its violence and corruption. But there were some things that it did right. I mean, you could go from Cairo to Baghdad to Istanbul without crossing any borders. There was, in particular regions, like say a city, the Greeks ran their affairs, the Armenians ran their affairs, they had interactions and so on. I think that's a pretty good type of arrangement to look forward to for the Levant, and in fact for much of the rest of the world. Actually, one of the healthy things in Europe is it's beginning to move towards such arrangements. So I'm not wedded to imperial boundaries. All of these things are transitional stages in my view. I don't think states are legitimate altogether. But if you really are in favor of a binational state, what's called the one-state settlement, if you're in favor of that, if you advocate it, advocacy doesn't mean I put it on a banner and shout about it. It means I think about ways of getting there. Then I think the only proposal I've ever heard is work through the international consensus and international law, and then go on from there.
But I guess that some people, what some people say is that once you've got a two-state solution, once it's established, you can't really move, it'd be a final sort of status. And the settlements, for example, like I'm talking about the huge ones like Gush Etzion and Male Adumim, they're sitting on water resources, and so how do you deal with Male Adumim is, I think,
well,
50,000
the people who say that you can't do anything about it are saying, let's give up. That's exactly what they're saying. They're saying nothing's possible, let's give up. They may not understand that they're saying that, but if they think about it, they are. I'll repeat, I do not know of any advocacy of a one-state, binational state solution that does not move through stages. As far as I know, there is none. There are people who shout about it and have slogans and say, isn't it wonderful, and so on. You could do the same about a no-state solution. Let's get rid of those imperial boundaries. I don't want to have states. I don't want to have one state. It's just imperial imposed boundaries. Fine. That's nice. You can propose that. You can propose that everybody should live in peace. You can make all kinds of proposals. But if you really want to achieve those objectives, you have to ask, how do we get there? And the only way I know is through the overwhelming international consensus and international law. Now, the cases you mention are real, and something has to be said about them if you're serious. And what should be said about them, I think, is pretty straightforward. First, as a practical matter, the IDF, the Israeli army, should withdraw from the occupied territories. And we're not just talking to Israel here, we're talking to the United States, which is crucial. The U.S. should stop at once supporting any Israeli action that in the occupied territories. That's the U.S. government, so no more arms sales. It's no more military training. It's U.S. corporations, Motorola, Caterpillar, the rest of them. Our primary short-term objective should be to get them to all withdraw from any activity in the occupied territories. Well, what's going to happen then? What's going to happen then is probably 90% of the settlers will get into the lorries provided for them by the government, and if the U.S. wants to subsidize it, fine. And they'll move from their subsidized homes in the West Bank to their subsidized homes inside Israel's boundaries. There'll be some who'll stay. Okay, they don't have to be removed. They can stay in a Palestinian state.
But this, in my opinion, this will... first, I think that's what the IDF and the US is slowly trying to do by actually training the PA force that is now sort of dealing with internal...
Totally wrong. They're training what they're trying to do and planning to do, and it's explicit, is to take over most of the occupied territories. The settlements already cover over 42% of them. That's even not counting the Jordan Valley, which they're going to take over. So they take over the Jordan Valley, take over roughly 40% of the West Bank, train a neo-colonial army, which will repress the population in the sectors that are left behind. And that's exactly what they're doing and taking pride in. You read people like John Kerry, Obama's sort of point man for the Middle East, a senator from here, liberal senator, head of the Foreign Relations Committee. He says finally Israel has a legitimate negotiating partner because the Palestinian army, the Keith Dayton army, the army run by General Keith Dayton, during the Gaza attack was able to suppress all public opposition to the attack in the West Bank, and that's a great achievement. We now have a neo-colonial army of the kind that we created in the Philippines a century ago, the National Guards in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. It's an old American tradition, and the British did the same before, and the French, and so on. So we create a neo-colonial army to control the population in the regions, the little regions that will allow the Palestinians to administer. And in a further neo-colonial step, which they're finally understanding, will allow islands of prosperity, like Ramallah. So Ramallah can become a tourist center for rich Americans and Swedes and others, where they can go and enjoy the great theater and the bars and nice hotels and so on. That's like any third world country. And meanwhile, the population will be repressed by the army that we're creating for them. That's what they're proposing. And if we don't like that, Maybe somebody likes that. Okay, I don't have to talk to them. If they don't like that, then they'll be calling for a two-state settlement, which will withdraw the IDF from the territories. In fact, that'll be the first step.
Yeah, but the two-state solution we clearly keep the big settlements. So I guess
we don't keep anything. If first of all, a preliminary to a two-state, there are many preliminaries, but one preliminary is withdrawing the IDF and withdrawing any U.S. support for either the IDF or the corporations that are operating in the settlements or any of the products of the settlements or anything else. Withdraw all that. After that, there'll be no real barrier to the international consensus. So there can be a two-state settlement. And then what happens to the people there is up to them. I think it's very likely that what will happen is exactly what I described. The overwhelming majority of them, who are economic settlers, will go back to Israel.
But I mean, Israel is clearly. I mean, if you listen to all the state, like to all the prime minister, Israel is a colonial state, and so how would you? And the settlement enterprise is clearly one of the arm of Israel. So how do you? And how do you make sure the settlements...
Exactly.
They never leave the settlements, in my opinion.
If they want to stay there, they can be part of a Palestinian state, but it's not up to you and it's not up to me, and I don't care. I mean, if the people in Mahaleh Adumim want to live in a Palestinian state, it's up to them. My guess is they won't. They're subsidized to stay there. If the subsidy is withdrawn and they have to face the fact that they're not the rulers of the land, the lords of the land, as they're called in Israel, they're going to go back to Palestine, to Israel.
But how do you make sure? How do you make sure that? I mean, at the moment, it looks like the settlement enterprise is going to just get bigger and bigger.
Because we're paying for it.
Okay, but how do you
stop paying for it? Stop paying for it. Stop supporting it. Stop subsidizing it. Stop allowing the IDF to remain in the territories, and Israel will then have two choices. One choice is to follow U.S. orders. Another choice is basically suicide. Okay, that's up to them. If they decide to violate U.S. orders, they're alone in the world. They have no protection. And in fact, in the past, if you look, they have always followed U.S. orders for a very good reason. They need it. So the basic problem is here and in Europe, which trails along like cowards after the United States. So the United States and Europe, yeah, that's the problem. If they're willing to take the step of terminating the occupation, compelling the IDF to withdraw, putting an end to any of their support for the occupation activities, Israel has those choices. I think it's overwhelmingly clear that the government will go along with the orders. At that point, there are possibilities. There could be a military coup. Like there could be a military coup in Israel if the army said, I'm not going to follow orders. Okay, in that case, Israel's just a pariah state, which will lose all of its support and will probably disappear. So the other possibility is the army will go along. The settlers will then have a choice, and they can make whatever choice they like. My guess is their choice will be to leave their subsidized homes in the area where they're lords of the land and go back to subsidized homes in Israel.
But it looks like there's no political will from the U.S. to actually give Israel orders.
Yeah, therefore, if we're serious about a two-state or a one-state or a no-state solution, we'll be trying to change U.S. policy and European policy.
And that's, I guess, an internal struggle in the U.S.
And Europe.
In Europe, okay.
Yeah, sure. It's, you can't change U.S. and European policy by talking about Israeli crimes. In fact, that detracts from it.
What I think, in a way, is that what you're saying now is what people, like supporters, let's call it, for the one-state or binational state solution, are saying that actually it's already one state now because and the struggle is internal.
See, that's a logical error. People are saying that on all sides. And it's just a plain logical error. The way the issue is formulated now by a lot of the solidarity movement, by Israel, by international observers, is that there are two options. Either you accept the international consensus in the which would have to be in the manner I described, first getting rid of the IDF and so on. So either you do that or else it's one state and you have a civil rights anti-apartheid struggle. Those aren't the two options. There's a third option, namely what Israel and the United States are in fact doing. That's the third option. What they're in fact doing is what I just described. Taking over, by now it's over 42% of the territories, making sure they control the Jordan Valley, imprisoning the rest, setting up a standard neo-colonial pattern and whatever segments are left to the Palestinians. No civil rights struggle, no demographic problem, as it's called for Israel, no Arabs in a Jewish state. If you don't look at the realistic option, of course you're not going to make a sensible proposal.
And I guess, again, some people actually, if you look at the facts on the ground, again, the two-state solution looks very difficult, and people that have lived there and sort of were pro two-state solution are now saying, how do you work out the huge bypass road? How do you work out the settlements? How do you work out the water resources?
Exactly the way I just described. I mean, I don't know how many times I have to repeat it. I have it in print 1,000 times. You do it. The first step is to stop supporting the IDF present in the occupied territories. If people can't agree with that, I really have nothing to talk to them about. I mean, if supporters of one state settlement say, yeah, I want to keep the IDF there, okay, we're not talking anymore. So the first step ought to be to end all actions that are helping the IDF stay in the occupied territories. And there are many such actions right here and in Europe. So put an end to them. Put an end to support for the corporate system that is participating in the occupation. Put an end to any support for the settlements, like buying their products or anything like that. Put an end to all of that. At that point, things will go the way I described. Israel will have, to repeat, Israel will have the choice of accepting the orders of the United States and its European subsidiary, or defying them. It's never defied them in the past, for good reasons, because if it does defy them, it's lost. If it does decide to defy them, to adhere to them, then comes the question as to whether there'll be a military coup. If there isn't, we continue. If there is, see, even where Israel's really in bad trouble in that case. But I suspect that what will happen is what usually happens. The leaders of the state will recognize the political, economic realities, the strategic realities, and follow the orders of the master, call for withdrawal, and start implementing it. Then comes the question about what the people in the settlements do, and I've already said it. I think it doesn't matter. I mean, it's up to them. But what I think is very likely is that they will move from their subsidized homes in the place where they are lords of the land to subsidized homes in Israel. Some will remain. There'll be some people from Brooklyn who want to hang on to every rock. Okay, let them hang on to every rock in a Palestinian state. And that takes care of the water resources. It takes care of everything you've mentioned. Furthermore, it is the only proposal that actually can be implemented. It doesn't have any alternatives. There's no alternative suggestion. It's important to recognize. The alternatives that are proposed are slogans, not suggestions as to how to do anything.
Okay. Don't you think that actually Netanyahu defied orders about the settlements?
No, he didn't. Because if you take a look, that's propaganda. Obama repeated George Bush's words. He repeated what's in the roadmap, and that was considered, very aggressive. He repeated what's in the roadmap, no natural growth of settlements. But he did it with a wink. When he was asked at his spokesperson was asked at a press conference, are you going to do what George Bush #1 did? Bush #1 actually imposed pretty mild sanctions for Israel's violation of orders. So you're going to do that? He said, no, this is purely symbolic. That's telling Netanyahu, go ahead and do what you like.
Okay. And my other question then is, for example, in Gaza, the settlers have left and the IDF have left. So this could happen. No, I know, but this could happen to the West Bank as well. And we know that Israel is still occupying Gaza. So what do you do once the IDF has left?
Let's take a look at Gaza. In Gaza, Israel staged a totally fraudulent national trauma for the benefit of the Goyim. Let's make it look as if there's a national trauma, so we can then shout, never again, you know, Holocaust and so on. They left for very sensible reasons. Sharon, who is not an idiot, understood that there's no point, now that Gaza has been destroyed essentially, there's no point keeping 8,000 settlers there, protected by half the IDF and taking most of the resources and land. Let's get them out, we don't want that, and put them in the West Bank, which we care about. If he'd wanted, if he hadn't, and let's do it in such a way that the outside world will think we're suffering and we're giving something up. So let's have the IDF take kids by force out of the settlements, so you can have a front page picture in the newspaper about the little boy pleading with the soldiers not to destroy my home and so on. All show for the Goyim, you know, and then we'll be able to say never again, so we can hang on to the West Bank. What they could have easily done is exactly what I just described. Announce it on August 1st, 2 weeks before the withdrawal. Announce the IDF is leaving Gaza. Okay. At that point, the 8,000 settlers would have piled into the lorries provided to them, moved over to the West Bank to subsidize homes there. No national trauma. In fact, it was so transparent, it was just ridiculed by Israeli commentators like Baruch Kimmerling. Furthermore, what made it even more ridiculous is that it was a replay, point-by-point replay of what Israel did in 1982. In 1982, after they were compelled to accept an offer from Sadat, which in fact was from 1971, which made him withdraw from the Sinai, they staged the same kind of trauma. In fact, it was so transparent then. I remember a headline, I think, Haaretz, called National Trauma 82, about the fakery of taking the settlers out of Yamit, where they had no right to be in the first place, of course, and pretending it was a great national trauma, so never again, and so on. Well, it worked in international propaganda the first time, so they figured they'd try it again, and it worked in Gaza. But they never left Gaza, you know. It remains under occupation, the siege became much more intense a couple of months later when Hamas won the election, and it goes on from there. There's nothing to do with the West Bank.
Okay. No, I've got two more questions, but I know we had half an hour, and it's been...
Well, let's go on and see how far we can go.
Okay, so a quick question about the refugees, because what people that say you're Zionist for a Jewish state, they say that's why you're against the right of the refugees and the descendant.
Well, so, actually, first of all, I'm in favor of the right of the refugees to return, and always have been. There's nothing in the law about their descendants. People who appeal to Resolution 194 haven't read it. Resolution 194 talks about the refugees, does not talk about their descendants. Sooner or later, Israel is going to say, okay, we accept 194 because nobody's left. Now, UNRWA and others have interpreted to refer to the descendants, which is reasonable. So let's accept that it's not in the law, but let's accept the interpretation. Should the refugees and the descendants have the right to return? Yes. Should the Wampanoag Indians have the right to return here? Yes. Is it going to happen? No. If you dangle before the eyes of the Wampanoag Indians the statement that I'm going to support your right to return to Boston and kick out the population, so therefore you stay in rotten conditions and don't do anything, that is a deeply immoral act, deeply immoral. If you care about the refugees who are not going to return to Israel, that's a fact. There's absolutely no international support for it, zero. And if there ever was any, unimaginably, Israel would use its ultimate weapons to prevent it. They'd resort to nuclear war. So it's just not going to happen. So the right can be affirmed and should be affirmed, as it should be for Native Americans and for plenty of others. There should be efforts to ameliorate the very ugly conditions of the refugees, as Wally Jumblatt just pushed through the Lebanese parliament. It's a good step, finally. So now they have at least a limited right to work. We should all be in favor of that. We should try to think of solutions in which their possibility of returning to the former Palestine is advanced, and there are a couple of ways to do that. One is by a two-state settlement, which will at least give them the opportunity to go back to not back, but to go to a Palestinian state. Once the further conditions that I would anticipate are realized and borders begin to erode, yeah, there might be possibilities for them to go right back. But if anyone can think of an alternative to that, I'd like to hear it. The only alternative I hear again is a slogan, which is about as reasonable and as moral as the slogan saying the Wampanoag Indians should come back to Boston.
Okay, so you're saying that they have the rights. I mean,
they should have the right.
They have the rights, and
they should have the right, and the right should be affirmed. And in fact, if you look at there have been a couple of approximations to a settlement. The only one with an interstate character was in Taba in January 2001, where the two sides came pretty close to a settlement, and they dealt with this issue. And the conclusion, Palestinians and Israelis, was yes, we should affirm the right of return, but we should recognize that it's only going to be implemented symbolically in the short term. Well, if somebody can think of an alternative to that, I'd like to hear it. A real alternative, not a feel-good slogan. It makes me feel good to say they should come back, but an alternative that takes into account the suffering and needs of the refugees. That's what I mean by a real alternative. If there is one, let's hear it.
Actually, sorry, but I'd like to go back on one thing about the binational and one state, because for some people it's very not clear what is a binational and what is a one state. Is it one person, one vote? Is it one state with two people with different... What do you exactly... Yeah.
I mean, in multi-ethnic... In the United States, you can have one state. It's a pretty homogeneous society by international standards. It's homogeneous because the indigenous population was eliminated. And then it was settled by, English colonists, Scotch-Irish, other Europeans. So it's, by international standards, pretty homogeneous. You go from here to Los Angeles, it looks the same. Same McDonald's, the same language, pretty much same culture. You can't do that in Europe. You go a couple of miles in Europe, you're in a different place. Okay, and in fact, internally to Europe, the state system, like everywhere else, has been imposed by violence, extreme violence. I mean, the various, Europe had a complex structure. They're being forced into a state system by violence. In fact, it's pretty recent. Just in the last generation or two, dozens of languages and cultures are being wiped out in Europe just by television and national education systems and so on. So yeah, you can force people into by force and violence, you can force them into the rigid framework of a single state. And you can do it in an extreme way, as was done here by just wiping them all out and then bringing in settlers. But most societies are much more complex. And a decent arrangement for them would be to pay attention to multi-ethnic variety. That has to be done in different ways in different parts of the world. And it's beginning to take place in Europe. So in Spain, for example, for long, under Franco, the dictatorship, Catalan was banned, you couldn't have a Catalan flag, couldn't talk it in the streets and so on. As soon as it became more or less democratic, it began to move towards a degree of Catalan autonomy, degree of Basque autonomy, degree of the same is likely to happen in Asturias and elsewhere. In Britain, there have been similar developments. So Wales and Scotland have a degree of autonomy. Welsh has been revived, the Scottish Parliament, and so on. And I think things like that make sense in real societies. Now take, say, Israel-Palestine. It's just beyond any question that there are two quite distinct societies, cultures, languages, and so on. So any settlement other than pure violence is going to be binational. Okay? If you want to reenact the history of Europe, which was the most savage place in the world for hundreds of years because of efforts to try to impose this arbitrary state system. If you want that, fine, you can talk about one state. If you're hoping for some settlement that at least takes into account the elementary rights of people, it's going to be a binational state. It could erode further, because there's plenty of other, people are not identified purely by their ethnic nature. They got all kind of other associations. That's why the binationalism in which I was involved in the 1940s was socialist binationalism, appealing to common interests among Jewish and Arab workers. You could argue that was an illusion. I don't really think so, but that was the basis for it. So let's talk about class interests and other interests which divide people in other ways, cultural interests, artistic interests, whatever. Now, that can erode a binational system. But to simply say, well, let's have one state and one vote, that's just to say, I don't care about the people there. I want to impose on them a European-style one-state system by force.
Okay, I think we're going to have to.
Yeah.
We're going to have to stop. I had one more question. So, if I can come back at 5, I guess.
Yeah, we can do it at 5.
That'd be a question. Okay. Okay. So I'll just come to my question about the BDS movement, because that's where a lot of criticism about your position in Palestine is coming from. The last sort of 3 paragraphs of the call for BDS pretty much says, we, representative of Palestinian civil society, call upon international civil society organizations and people of conscience all over the world to impose broad boycotts and implement divestment initiatives against Israel, similar to those applied to South Africa and the apartheid area. We appeal to you to pressure your respective states to impose embargoes and sanctions against Israel. We also invite conscientious Israelis to support this call for the sake of justice and genuine peace. Then there's 3 steps. Is ending the occupation and colonization of Arab lands and dismantling the wall, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, and respecting, protecting and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and property as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. When you read this, it sounds like a call for, a self-determination on the part of the Palestinian people.
And destruction of Israel.
Okay. Yeah. So anyway, what do you...
furthermore, the hypocrisy rises to heaven. I mean, yes, all of these are the right things to do. It's 100 times worse in the United States, or in England, or in any other country you talk about. Why not boycott? Why not call for that in the United States?
But I think that's a call from the Palestinian people, and if
it's not a call from the Palestinian people, it's a call from groups who call themselves the Palestinian people. I've never seen in fact, it's been hard enough to try to get the Palestinian people to boycott settlement produce. And the very people who are calling for this, are perfectly happy to study in Tel Aviv University. So it's not a call from the Palestinian people.
But it's been signed up.
But even if it were, let's say it were a call from the Palestinian people, if I care about any people, let's say it's the Somali people, if the Somali people issue a call, do I blindly follow it? Or do I ask, is implementing the call going to help them or hurt them? Well, if I care about them, I'm going to ask the second question. Will it help them or hurt them? Now, it's pretty obvious what this call will do. It's a gift to Israeli and U.S. hardliners. I mean, they know perfectly well that there's not going to be an implementation of the right to return. The hypocrisy is so transparent that they just use it as a weapon to discredit the entire movement. And it's happened over and over, incidentally. So yes, if you want to put that, if you really hate the Palestinians, it's a good step, because it's going to harm them, predictably. And in fact, it's already happened. I can give you examples if you like. Actually, long before this movement was started, organized, I was involved in BDS activities, some of them the right kind, which could be helpful. Some of them, which I just got into for reasons of solidarity, for the wrong kind. So, for example, there was one here, right where we are, Harvard and MIT, in 2002, after Jenin. That's, before the BDS movement, this one got organized. And it was a pretty good statement. I thought it had just the right things. But the people who put it together, insisted on 3 words, which I thought were a mistake. The words were to the universities, and divest from Israel. Now, there's a reason why that's a mistake, because of the hypocrisy. Why not divest from the United States? First of all, every Israeli crime traces back to the United States, and that's a fragment of U.S. crimes. I mean, they're much worse. People say, I've read, well, Israeli universities don't condemn the occupation. Did Harvard and MIT condemn the invasion of Vietnam? No, they took part in it. They not only didn't condemn it, they directly took part in it. Did anybody call for boycotting them? Are they calling for boycotting them now? And remember, their support for, U.S. support for Israel, which is decisive, is a fraction of U.S. crimes. Now, we can say the same about England and France and on and on. So those particular words could be attacked and were attacked as pure anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, that was with justice. So the president of Harvard immediately picked on them and made an impassioned speech saying, we've got to worry about anti-Semitism at Harvard. Okay, for the next couple of months, the only issue around here was anti-Semitism at Harvard, which doesn't exist. Jenin disappeared, the Palestinians disappeared, and so on. So if you really want to harm the Palestinians, that was a good proposal.
But I think that for having been in Israel-Palestine many times throughout the last few years, I've spoken to people that are not, representatives of Palestinian civil society, they're just Palestinians living in Bilain, Nilain, and they told me, we know it might hurt us. For example, Israeli...
We know what?
We know it might hurt us. Israeli products are better quality, for example.
No, that's not what we're talking about. That's not what we're talking about. If they're talking about what they should do. Now, if they want to take Israeli products, okay, that's their choice. I'm not saying they should or they shouldn't. It is a fact, however, that the Palestinians have not been able to implement a boycott, even on the settlements, let alone on Israeli products. But that's their problem. We're talking about an entirely different question. What should we do? Should we take steps which we have every reason to believe are going to harm the Palestinians? I don't think so. But if people feel like doing that, okay, just join AIPAC and do it straight out. On the other hand, there are very good BDS proposals, very effective ones. I've been in favor of them and, in fact, involved in them for years, even before this alleged movement began. They're ones that make sense. They target the occupation. First, to be a decent tactic, these are tactics, not principles. A tactic has to meet at least 2 conditions. One, it has to be helpful to the victims, not harmful to them. And 2, it has to be educational. That is, it's directed at somebody. It's symbolic, of course, like other nonviolent actions. It's directed at somebody. It's directed at an audience. It has to help educate them, not miseducate them, so that then they'll be able to go on and take further actions. That's the whole point of civil disobedience. Okay, now, there are many proposals that have exactly that effect. So, for example, those that call for, say, an end to U.S. arms sales to Israel has exactly that effect. If symbolic, of course, but if implemented, yes, it would benefit the Palestinians. 2, it educates Americans and Europeans, who are the crucial people here. It educates them because it gets them to focus at home. It's really easy to blame the other guy. Look at those awful people in Darfur and so on. It's a little harder to look into the mirror, but that's what counts. Look into the mirror, find out what we're doing, what we're responsible for, what we can change, always crucial, and particularly crucial here, because what we're doing has a decisive influence on policy. So you want to educate people here to look at home, do the hard thing, and pay attention to what's going on here and try to change it. That's what we can do. Well, if you focus on arms sales, on corporations operating in the occupied territories, on purchase of goods from the occupied territories, and so on, it meets those 2 criteria. On the other hand, if you say, let's boycott Tel Aviv University, or let's insist on boycotting Israel until they end internal repression, anybody with a brain is just going to laugh. I mean, there's no internal repression in the United States. Do we boycott Harvard, which is a much worse Probably so. They're just going to laugh, and it's going to be a weapon in the hands of hardliners.
But I agree. But I think it's a pragmatic decision, and it's a lot easier to hurt a small country like Israel through a boycott than to hurt this huge imperial country like the U.S.
No, it's not. It's quite the opposite. It's immediately understood to be just saying, let's go after something that's easy, not after something that's principled. So therefore, it's just hypocrisy, and therefore we reject it, which is exactly what happened, as in the case that I mentioned.
Because the boycott.
And incidentally, if you want to talk about South Africa, let's be serious about it. South Africa, the real boycott movement took off in around 1980. And by the time it took off, that was after decades of educational and organizational work, which had led to a situation in which there was virtually no support for apartheid. I mean, American corporations were beginning to pull out for their own reasons. Congress was beginning to pass sanctions and so on. There's nothing like that going on in this case because the work hasn't been done. So if you want the South African analogy, do the work. Okay, then when you get overwhelming opposition to the Israeli occupation and U.S. support for it, fine, then you can do these things. In fact, there's more to the South African analogy. If people would pay attention to the history. Around 1960, South African nationalists recognized that they're becoming a pariah state. And the foreign minister actually approached the U.S. ambassador and told him, look, we know we're being voted down in the UN and so on and so forth, but you and I know that there's only one vote at the United Nations, yours. It doesn't matter what the world thinks or does, as long as you support us, we're okay. And that's turned out to be exactly correct, exactly. By the 1980s, as I said, even Congress was passing sanctions. Reagan had to get around the congressional sanctions to keep supporting South Africa. He did. As late as 1988, the U.S. denounced the African National Congress as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. Mandela just got off the terrorist list last year. And apartheid was working fine. Looked like they'd won everything. They were gloating in their victory. A year or two later, U.S. policy shifted. A couple of years after that, apartheid was gone. Now that tells you that if you're serious about helping the Palestinians, you'll pay attention to the South African analogy, not mythology about it.
I think the BDS, you call it an alleged movement, before living in Europe and being to the, it's really a movement. And
yes, and what you're missing is that I've always supported it even before it existed, when it was properly targeted. If it's targeted in a way which meets the basic two criteria, helping Palestinians and educational, not only do I support it now, I supported it before it began. If it's, on the other hand, designed to harm Palestinians and to miseducate people, then I'm not in favor of it.
But how could he, because you're saying that it's not coming from the Palestinian, but more and more organizations have signed this call for boycott. I think it's 170 now inside Palestine. There's also a boycott from within, in Israel, from Israel. So how you're actually saying that the Palestinian...
That is just totally irrational. First of all, if Palestinians within... They've tried, the leadership at least, has tried to get them to boycott Israeli settlements and Israeli products. That's fine, that's their business. But if, say, let's take away Palestinians, if Somalis, authentically, organized Somalis, put forth a call to me, which I can see is going to harm them, I'm not going to follow it. At least if I care about Somalis. Of course, I don't care about them, I'll follow it.
So let's say if really the call was from every single Palestinian in Israel and in Palestine, you're saying that you want to support them and not harm them, but how would they feel if they say, to support us, could you do this PDS?
Could you do something which will harm us? What I would do is do exactly what I've done for years when I've talked to Palestinian groups who have been pretty self-destructive, I should say. This goes back to the 70s when the PLO was extremely self-destructive. And I met leadership and others with Ed Said and Eqbal Ahmed and other people who cared about the Palestinians. And what we tried to tell them is, look, you're calling for this and you're acting this way, but you're harming the Palestinians. That's what we tried to explain to them. Didn't work very well with the PLO. That was Ed Said's Despair and Iqbal Ahmed's. But yeah, that's exactly what you do in any case when you're dealing with oppressed people. I mean, if Black Panthers had said, okay, let's go out and smash all the banks, I wouldn't have said, well, okay, you're the blacks, so therefore I'm going to go smash all the banks. If they had said that, which they didn't, I would have said, look, you're making a mistake. The actions you're calling for are going to harm you, and you should rethink what you're doing. If we care about people, that's the way we react to them. If there are BDS tactics that help the Palestinians and help educate Americans and Europeans, so therefore they will act in ways that matter, of course I'm in favor of it.
Mm. Okay. We have to go. Okay. Thanks a lot, Noam.
Yeah.